Welcome, and we'll start, of course, with our bracha. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah.
Amen.
Go ahead and share the screen. And we are now into the third of the parshiot that deal with the story of Joseph. This really is I guess we could call it a patriotic finish, because this is just a wonderful, wonderful climax to the book of Genesis and some of the issues, especially the issues of brotherly hatred, which of course starts off right at the beginning with Cain and Abel, and then proceeds through Ishmael and Isaac and Esau and Jacob and Joseph and his brothers. And here it is going to be resolved. In fact, at this particular point in our parsha, because as you can see, we're on the Revi'i portion, this has become resolved. It gets resolved somewhat at the beginning of this parsha. And so at this point, Joseph has told his brothers to go back and tell their father that he is alive, that he will take care of them during these years of famine, and that they should come down to Egypt. So the brothers have arrived, and the last sentence is that Jacob saw the carriages, the agalot, the carts, which Joseph sent to carry him to Egypt. He didn't have to walk, he could ride there. Vayomi Yisrael, and Israel, that is of course Jacob, thought or said, Rav od Yosef b'nichav, it's enough that my son Joseph is alive. Elcha, I will go, ve'er'enu, and I will see him, b'terem amut, before I die. Of course, Jacob at this point is quite aged, and he wants to see for himself. They don't have Zoom back then, and of course we all know that actually being in the physical presence of someone makes a difference.
Was he 137 years old?
When he died, I believe he was. But at this point, he was younger than that. We could probably do a calculation on the basis of that, but I'd have to sit down and do all the figuring out to be able to calculate that. I'm not sure if Jacob had 17 years in Egypt where he was able to be with Joseph. That's sort of somewhere in the back of my memory. Let's keep going. So we're on verse Chavchet. Here it is. Rav od. So it is an interesting expression, this Rav od, right? Because Rav generally means it is great. So it could mean, although it just doesn't fit. In other words, it's amazing, it's a fantastic thing that my son Joseph is still alive. So it could certainly have that meaning to it. But I think that it actually, Rashi's going to give us a different way. So he connects Rav and Od. Okay? And he says, Rav li Od simcha. I will have yet much more joy. V'chedva, again, another word for simcha. It's a synonym, happiness. Or Ilva or Yosef b'nichai, since my son Joseph is still alive. So I have much happiness to look forward to in that my son Joseph is alive.
Did Jacob ever know what the brothers did to him?
Say that again.
Did Jacob ever know what the brothers did to Joseph?
Good
Did
question.
he ever have an inkling of it?
Right, that is a really good question, Harlan. I don't think so. I don't think that he actually was aware. That's a really great question. It isn't, there's nothing that I have come across to suggest that he thought the brothers had done that he was aware of it. Remember, they even kept it secret from Reuben. They didn't even tell Reuben what had happened. I mean, we all know there are things that we carry around inside of ourselves that we feel too ashamed to share. And certainly, now, the thing is this, that when the brothers come and tell Joseph in Vayechi, in the next week's portion, they come and cook up the story. But I think you've just uncovered why it's a complete fabrication, the story that they give Joseph, where they ask him to spare them once Jacob has died. There's no evidence whatsoever that Jacob would have said such a thing because he wasn't aware of what the brothers had done. So we'll see if we come across that at the time when we, next week when we do Parshat Vayechi. At any rate, Yisrael. I mean, just to continue a little bit along the question that you asked is, there's nothing that he says to the brothers about it. There's just nothing. And we'd have to imagine, can you imagine how he would have felt about those sons of his? How ashamed he would have been? How hurt he would have been? It was bad enough that he thought that Joseph was dead. I mean, that just killed him in a way, right? He says he's going to go down to the grave with his gray hairs, which basically means he's never going to get over it. So it's all set up. I mean, his love of Rachel at first sight, it all starts with his seeing Rachel and falling in love with her. And consequently, and then she dies when she gives birth to Benjamin. So all he has left of her is her children. So, yeah, it's all part of the dynamic and the well thought out psychology of this story. Vayisa Yisrael v'chol asher lo. So new chapter, right? Israel, basically it means journeyed, v'chol asher lo, and all that he owned. Vayavo be'er Shava, and he came to Be'er Sheva. Vayizbach zvachim, and he offered sacrifices there. LeElokei Aviv Yitzchak, to the God of his father Isaac. Some questions come out of this particular statement, right? So Rashi does. First of all, Be'er Shava. Right? And Rashi just reminds us, I think he's told us this already, Kamo leve'er Sheva. It's the equivalent of saying le, which we're very familiar with, which means that prefix means to. It means the same as to Beersheba. He came to Beersheba. And he says, hey, the sof teva, that in Hebrew, grammatically, if you put a hey, the letter hey, at the end of a word, in lamed betchila, it's the equivalent of putting a lamed at the beginning. So, for example, Yerushalayim would be to Jerusalem instead of Yerushalayim. You can say it either way. I suspect maybe, it's just a feeling I have, that the Yerushalayim is a little bit more poetic than Yerushalayim. So that could be the difference. Here's another thing, Elohei Aviv Yitzchak. So why does it say to the God of his father Isaac? Why doesn't it say to the God of his father Abraham? And Rashi has an answer. It's based on Chayav Adam Yichvod Aviv. A person is obligated to show honor to his father, Yoter Mivachod Zakeno, more than the honor he shows to his grandfather. Is he supposed to show honor to his grandfather? Certainly. It's just a question of comparison. Lefichach talam b'Yitzchak, and that's why we said the God of his father Isaac, the Lord of Abraham, and we didn't say the God of Abraham. Next verse.
But why did he say that at all? I mean, because it's also his God, right? So I mean, so the question I had when that came up was not only about Isaac, but also why was the statement even either it could be his God or nothing, in the sense that yeah. So anyway, that's my question.
So I'm so glad you asked that question, and someone might accuse you of being my shill, okay? Because
okay, yeah, sure, okay.
I want to. When I give you the answer, you will understand. All right. And the answer is, I have thought over many, many years and many, many decades to understand better that statement, Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. What, to try and deconstruct it in a way that makes the most sense. I've tried. And most recently, it occurred to me that, and it's on the basis of a whole bunch of different kinds of thoughts regarding the way Elohim and Adonai, and I've explained more recently that I believe that the term Adonai has to do, the reason why it's the ineffable name, right, it's the name you don't even pronounce, is that it represents divine ineffability. And I define ineffable as those things that we don't know we don't know. They are so hidden from us, we're not aware that they're even hidden from us. And that term Adonai represents that element that we can even express regarding the divine, the nature of the divine, and how beyond, how transcendent it really is. And the word Elohim, on the other hand, has to do with that element that we try to understand, that element of the divine that we try to connect with. And that's why the word Elohim is also connected to a word that means to judge. In other words, that we see ourselves as being judged by this divine ultimate power beyond the universe, that we have a connection and a responsibility to that particular power. That now runs deep into what Judaism is about. And when we say Shema Yisrael, I had read this many years ago, but never really kind of put it together, that when we say Shema Yisrael, hear, O Israel, the Israel we're talking about is in fact Jacob. That when we say Shema Yisrael, we are speaking across the years to our ancestor Jacob. And then we are saying Hashem Elokeinu, Eloheinu, that Hashem, the Hashem that you believed in, is Eloheinu, is also our God. In other words, we are identifying our belief with the belief that Jacob had, and Adonai Echad, the Lord is one, can also mean not just describing God's internal unity and essential unity, but saying that it is the same God, that the God that Jacob believed in is the God we believe in. And that's why we have that connection. In other words, being able to, in a sense, see a level of immortality in the belief that we have, that what we're saying is, because people have different understandings of God, and people have different, when they use that term, I've said it many times now, that the term God is just a shorthand, right, for something that we are trying to achieve. It's a process. But that is the most recent understanding I have of the Shema. So that when I say the Shema now, I'm trying to address my ancestor Jacob and to say to him, yes, your God is my God as well. Just like Ruth said to Naomi, your God will be my God. People have different gods.
Okay, so that's the point of saying that the God of his father Isaac, right, is basically they're demonstrating the link that exists, right, which is what you're just describing, which is absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, because that's extremely that's very helpful, and that's great. So okay, thank you. So
it has taken me 70 years or more to figure that out. By the way.
And I mean, we get it in 2 minutes, so that's really we're very grateful that we get the benefit. That's
well,
really.
I'm grateful to have been that God allowed me the process of trying to think this through. I'm not saying it may not be the last I understand of this clearly. There are many other ways to look at it too, but to me, this is really closest to what that statement is saying when we say it. And that idea of reaching out past the grave, past millennia, to have continuity is a powerful thought to me. And of course, it's a privilege to share it with all of you too. So that's why I think that that's part of the honor. Part of the honor we show our parents when we say "Kabed et avicha v'et imecha," to honor your parents, is to continue the values and try to live out that. Hopefully, if they were in fact really, really righteous people, that we try to continue those values that they had. That, of course, is the whole point about Abraham and Sarah having a child, was to inculcate those values. And of course, that's part of the Shema, the first paragraph, V'shinantam levanecha, right? You shall teach diligently your children. There's a lot to think about there. So, continuing. Vayomer Elohim liYisrael. And Elohim, like the fact that it says Elohim here, by the way, liYisrael, although it does very often say Vayomer Hashem, it does use the term Adonai. So there may be more to that as to why that's being chosen. But anyway, this is the first time in this entire story, that we have divine revelation expressed in the story. There's nowhere in this story up to this point that it says God said to anyone. Doesn't say it. As I said, I believe that one of the many messages that this whole story of Joseph is trying to give to us is to sensitize us to see the workings of Hashem in our everyday lives, even in our hatreds and our adversity, but to understand the workings of something far greater than we understand, but to be open to it, to be sensitive. And that's why we don't see God speaking until here. Vayomer Elohim liYisrael, Elohim said to Israel, to Jacob, B'mar'ot halayla, in visions of the night, Vayomer Yaakov, Yaakov, and he said, Jacob, Jacob, Vayomer Hineni, and he said, here I am. And it occurs to me that part of people's rejection of religion, I mean, there are lots of reasons they may reject religion. I think part of the reason for anti-Semitism, has to do with the idea that people are commanded and that people can't just do whatever they like, that they're not their own gods, and that Judaism introduces such a notion of personal discipline and accountability, and people hate that, right? Ain't no one going to tell me what to do, and they really hate it. And they see Judaism, sort of whether they're conscious of it or not, they sort of have this understanding that it all comes from Judaism, which I'd like to think is the truth. At any rate, what I'm riffing on is the fact that he says, Hineni, here I am. And the point that I'm trying to make is that you have to be open. You have to be willing to listen to what it has to tell you. And that's what Hineni suggests. Here I am. My consciousness, my openness is willing to listen to what you're saying. And if you're open to it, then you start to see things. And basically, I'm saying that the reason why so many people reject the notion of a divine, of Hashem, etc., is because they don't want to be open to it. They don't want it. They kind of instinctively know there are implications to that belief. You don't just say, oh yeah, I believe in God and move on. You can't do that, because then you're not really believing God. Saying you believe in God carries with it a lot of implications in terms of your own personal choices and behaviors and learning how to be mindful and consistent to that, being open to that idea. But that's all sort of encapsulated in this word where Jacob says, Hineni, I'm here. I'm listening to you. I'm paying attention. So Rashi takes this, why the repetition, right? Why Yaakov, Yaakov? And he has a lovely, lovely response, which is Lashon Chiba. It has the implication of endearment, right? And we know that very often when we love someone, we like saying their name, right? I mean, saying their name is sometimes a way in which we express our love and the love that we have for someone. And their name is actually precious. You know, that's why somebody carved, that's, I suspect, why people carve names on trees and things like that. And that's why he says it twice. God is expressing his love of Jacob at this point. And I don't believe that anywhere else does he say, at least up to this point, that he says his name twice like this. In other words, I'd love to think that Jacob has at this point, grown so much from that punk that he was to begin with, right? Or at least if I just take a shot position on it, right? Cheating his brother twice, all this kind of stuff, right? And now he is this, sadder but wiser man. And he is in some ways broken, but broken in the best kind of way. And to break your heart is not a bad thing always, right? Sometimes it means you're deeply moved. So what's going on here underneath the sentence here? Vayomer, so God says to him, Anochi ha'el Elohei avicha. I am the God of your fathers. And understanding the God of your fathers now in a different kind of way, perhaps, right? That what's coming to you here is the genuine article. Al tira, do not fear, do not be afraid. Merda Mitzrayma, from going down to Egypt. Don't hesitate, don't worry. Ki lagoy gadol asimcha sham, for I will make you there a great nation. This is the great promise of Egyptian servitude and coming out of Egypt and becoming the Jewish people. And here it is. Okay? So more, he's going to say more. Let's take a look. Al tira merda Mitzrayma. Do not be afraid of going down to Egypt. Lefi. So the fact that he says don't be afraid, right? We know that from a positive you can infer a negative, and from a negative you can infer a positive. If he's saying don't be afraid, for sure you can say Jacob was afraid. Wouldn't tell him not to be afraid if he weren't. Okay. So why? Lefi shahaya meitzar, because he was unhappy, he was saddened, he was troubled. Al shenizkat latzeit l'chutza haaretz, because he was required to, it was necessary for him to go outside the land of Israel. He wasn't happy about that thought of leaving the land of Israel, the land of Canaan at that time. But that's why God is saying, hey, no problem, do it, because some important things are going to happen there. And God goes on to say to him, Anochi ered imcha, I will go down with you. So there's a sense, of course, that in the land of Israel, there's a greater sense of divine presence than elsewhere, than outside the land of Israel. But God is saying to him that he's going to go down to Egypt with him, that he's going to be present with Jacob, even in the land of Egypt. And the fact that I'm going down with you to Egypt. Va'anochi a'alcha gam alo, and I will certainly take you out. Alcha means to lift you up, right? Meaning the sense of aliyah when we talk about making aliyah, going up to the land of Israel. And the reason we use that kind of terminology has to do with a spiritual going up. Yosef.
Wasn't this all planned by God? When Joseph became a prince of the Pharaoh. This is all planned because of the God was going to make the land. Oh boy, I'm getting. He was going to make the land so you couldn't grow anything. It was all planned. that Joseph,
The famine.
the
The famine.
brothers would give to the Ishmaels, and the Ishmaels would give it to this pontiff, whatever his name was, and he went to prison, and he came out. He had a dream, and the Pharaoh took him in, and it was all planned to save lives. He was going to save a lot of lives because of the
famine. Yes.
the famine. That's what I couldn't get that.
It's okay, Harlan. We all have those moments. It's okay. Yes, absolutely. That's the whole idea, right? In fact, the rabbis put it very well, that when you think about it, for the sake of a cloak, the coat of many colors, for that sake, our ancestors wound up in Egypt. All because of that. that little incident. Anyway, yes.
So I have another question. Why does it have to say though that God, God will go with Jacob, right? Because God is everywhere. So I mean, so there must be a point about the emphasis aspect, because it doesn't need to be stated that, right? If God, yes, God is stronger, let's say, in the land of Israel, but still God exists all around us. So everywhere we go. So why? True. What is there must be a reason behind that.
Yes. So it could be. Okay, here's the thing. When we sin, when we do things that round counter to the divine will, we cut ourselves off in some ways from the divine presence. It's almost like a definition. Okay, by definition, that's what you're doing. When you choose to contravene, divine will, you're cutting yourself off. And so he's saying to Jacob, you're not sinning here. You're not doing anything wrong. I'm going to agree with you. And I think there's something more to it. You have to understand that the exile in Egypt is like the paradigm of Jewish history. Because what happened ultimately? Here we are living in the United States, right? Jews live all over the world outside the land of Israel. And something very important can happen there. And in some ways, it's saying the significance of exile, the whole idea of a diaspora. And what goes on, this is perhaps one of the greatest adversities. Look at how the Jews have suffered over the centuries, over the millennia, in the lands that weren't their own. Have been subject to abuse and discrimination and stuff like that. Sometimes they describe this whole history as a vale of tears. And I think there's a powerful message here that's actually a spiritual message, that's saying that our lives actually are a diaspora. That the life you and I are living right now is exile. And that at some point beyond this life, we will be coming back to our home. And it's a subtle way, maybe not so subtle, but I think it's a subtle way of saying, do not think that your experience in this world, and we are so privileged not to be suffering in ways that other people have suffered or continue to suffer. We're not, you look at, for example, what happened in Afghanistan to the people who had to be living in sheer terror, when the Taliban were taking over again. Imagine yourself, the people in Vietnam, when the Viet Cong took over, when Hanoi was now in charge, and the reprisals that they were worried that would be done to them. And we don't have to live like that. I know there appears to be a certain rise in anti-Semitism going on in this country, and I know there are people who are worried about it. It's interesting that the biblical position about that basically is that in some ways, the Jewish people have brought it on themselves. I'm not saying, I realize you don't want to blame the victim, but at least as a Jewish person myself, I feel that self-criticism is important. And unfortunately, here we are living at a time of plenty and abandoning our beliefs and our practices and things like that. This is the biblical story. You read the Bible, and that's always, the book of Judges is just full of that. You know, there was no king in Israel and everybody did what was right in their own eyes. Well, are we living in a time when people do what's right in their own eyes and don't feel that they have any responsibility or accountability? So it's saying, though, here that that's really important. Experiencing what we are doing is important. I certainly don't look forward to a time of adversity. I'd love to think that we could take our prosperity and, in fact, understand and be so appreciative and so grateful for it, that it affects our lives very deeply. And I think, look, I'm being critical, but the truth is there are many people who do understand that. And I hope to God that God, I know God sees these things, but that, the preponderance of our behavior is such to say, wow, we really appreciate this blessing, these blessings that we have, and we want to express them.
Right. But no, and I totally agree with everything you've said. I guess the one thing I'd ask, though, is, from the diaspora aspect, though, it doesn't wind up ending well. Like we got kicked out of Spain,
right.
And conquered by, Babylonia.
right.
So, it is a veil of tears. And we happen to be at a time period where, we're fortunate in this time period that, that hasn't happened, but that doesn't mean it can't happen, right? That's the fear, that we all carry around with us based on history. So the other point is that if God is saying it's not a sin to, to Jacob to go out of the land of Israel, but the other thing is that, he does have a legitimate right to fear, because that's, the diaspora has always had consequences, right? And we anyway, so maybe I'm way off base.
No. I think you're right. I think he's thinking all these things. But the other piece that I'm trying to bring out is that, while I don't seek adversity, I think what this is saying is that the adversity in the diaspora ultimately is of little consequence in the diaspora, because what's happened, one thing we know for sure is we're all mortal, and that it also actually is a way in which we will actually accomplish immortality, and that the real home is on the other side of the grave. And the truth is that all the power and pomp and what have you of this world amounts to pretty much nothing when you compare it to the universe itself and to history, in terms of the length of time that the universe has been in existence. It all kind of shrinks into relative insignificance. And one needs to recognize that sometimes small little things can have great significance in a universal sense. At any rate, we'll need to stop here, so I'm going to stop the share and stop the recording, and hope those enjoyed. If you're on this recording, I hope you're at this point and that you've enjoyed this morning's discussion.